You haven't thought about it in 30 years, and then one Tuesday afternoon, for no reason you can identify, while you're doing something as ordinary as folding a towel or waiting for water to boil, it comes back, and it comes back with so much force and so much detail that you actually stop moving. Because suddenly you are not in your kitchen anymore. You are standing in a hallway in 1979, looking at someone you loved and saying the exact wrong thing. Or you are sitting in an office in 1986, making a decision that you knew even then was a surrender. Or you are watching your child's face at the dinner table on a night when you were too exhausted or too angry or too absent to give them the version of you they actually needed. And the scene plays itself with a vividness that nothing from yesterday or last week could match. As if your brain has been preserving this one moment in higher resolution than anything else it has stored for decades, waiting for a quiet afternoon with no distractions to finally unseal it and lay it across your entire body like a weight you didn't know you were still carrying. And the strangest part is not that the memory returned, because memories return all the time. The strangest part is how much worse it feels now than it did when it actually happened. At 35, you could absorb that kind of regret the way you absorbed a bruise. You registered it and then kept walking, because there was a meeting in 20 minutes and children who needed to be picked up, and a future so long and so full of potential corrections that the mistake didn't feel permanent yet. But now, at 70 or 75, the same memory that once stung for an afternoon can sit inside your chest for days, and you cannot outrun it, and you cannot distract yourself from it the way you used to, because the specific machinery your brain once used to mute that kind of pain has fundamentally changed, and nobody told you that it would, and nobody prepared you for what it would feel like when it did. People around you, if they knew what was happening, would say, "Let it go. What's done is done. You can't change the past." And every one of those statements is technically true, and not one of them is remotely helpful, because your brain is not revisiting this memory as an intellectual exercise, and it is not doing this to punish you. It is doing something far more important and far more sophisticated than anyone in your life is likely to recognize. And once you understand what that process actually is and why it intensifies at exactly this stage of life, you will never again confuse it with weakness or self-pity or the early stages of decline. Let me show you what's really going on. In 2005, neuroscientist Giorgio Coricelli and his team published a landmark study in Nature Neuroscience that identified exactly where regret lives in the human brain. And the answer turned out to be one of the most evolutionarily advanced regions we possess, the medial orbitofrontal cortex, a part of the prefrontal system that sits right behind your eyes and is responsible for evaluating outcomes, comparing what happened against what could have happened, and generating the specific emotional signal we experience as "I should have done it differently." When participants in the study confronted outcomes they could have avoided, the medial orbitofrontal cortex activated alongside the anterior cingulate cortex and the hippocampus, which means regret is not a single emotion living in a single location, but a three-part neurological event that simultaneously evaluates the decision, generates emotional pain, and retrieves the original memory in vivid detail so the brain can examine it again. Regret, at the neural level, is your brain reopening a case file. It never fully closed. And here is the first reason it hits harder in your 70s than it did at 40. Your prefrontal cortex, the same region that houses the orbitofrontal area where regret is generated, is also the region responsible for regulating that regret, for dampening it, for putting it in perspective, for reminding you that one mistake does not define an entire life. In a younger brain, these two functions exist in a kind of balance. The regret is generated and then almost immediately modulated, contextualized, softened by a prefrontal system operating at full capacity. But research in cognitive neuroscience has consistently documented that the prefrontal cortex undergoes measurable structural and functional changes with age, particularly after 70, including reductions in gray matter volume and shifts in neurochemical availability that affect how efficiently it can regulate intense emotion. What this means in practice is that the part of your brain that feels the regret has not weakened at all. It is firing just as strongly as it ever did, but the part that would normally step in and turn the volume down is not responding with the same speed or force it once had. The regret plays at full blast with a diminished muting system. And this is why a memory that once registered as a 4 on your internal pain scale now registers as an 8 or a 9. Not because the event has gotten worse, but because the neurological buffer between the pain and your conscious experience of it has thinned. This alone would be enough to explain why regrets intensify with age. But there is a second mechanism at work that makes the experience even more powerful and even more misunderstood. Psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Victoria Medvec at Cornell University conducted a series of studies across the 1990s that uncovered one of the most important patterns in the psychology of regret. A pattern so consistent, it has been replicated with a sample of over 2,600 people. They found that regret follows a temporal rule. In the short term, people regret the things they did, the mistakes of action, the wrong word said, the bad investment made, the impulsive decision that blew up immediately. But over time, over years and decades, a dramatic inversion occurs, and the dominant regrets shift almost entirely to the things people didn't do, the risks not taken, the love not pursued, the truth not spoken, the life not built. This happens because regrets of action tend to produce concrete consequences that can be addressed, apologized for, corrected, or at least rationalized, while regrets of inaction remain permanently open-ended, leaving the brain to construct increasingly idealized versions of the life that might have been if only you had been brave enough, or free enough, or clear enough to choose differently. By the time you reach 70, you have had decades for this inversion to complete itself, and the regrets that remain are almost exclusively of the second type, the roads not taken, the versions of yourself you never got to become. And these are precisely the regrets that cannot be resolved because the door they refer to no longer exists. You cannot go back and tell your father you understood him. You cannot go back and take that job in another city when you were 31 and everything could have branched in a different direction. You cannot go back and hold your daughter the night she needed you and you didn't know it because you were staring at the ceiling thinking about work. The memory persists precisely because there is no available action that could close it. And an unresolvable regret is to the brain what an open wound is to the body. A site that keeps drawing resources and attention because the system cannot classify it as healed. And here is where I need to tell you something that almost no one says out loud because it doesn't fit the reassuring narrative that our culture prefers to tell about aging. Erik Erikson, the developmental psychologist whose work on the stages of human life remains one of the most influential frameworks in the history of the field, identified the central psychological task of late adulthood as a conflict between what he called integrity and despair. Integrity, in his framework, is the experience of looking back on your life and feeling that it was, on the whole, meaningful, that it held together, that the choices you made added up to something you can accept, even if it wasn't perfect. Despair is the opposite. The experience of looking back and feeling that critical parts of your life were wasted or wrong or irretrievable, and not having enough time remaining to build a different story. What Erikson understood, and what modern research has confirmed, is that this reckoning is not optional. It is a developmental process that the brain initiates whether you cooperate with it or not, and the raw material it uses to conduct this reckoning is exactly the material you are experiencing right now when that regret surfaces in your kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon. Your brain is not torturing you. It is conducting the most important audit of your entire life, and the regrets it keeps pulling up are the specific files it needs to examine in order to reach a verdict about whether your life, taken as a whole, makes sense. A study published in the International Journal of Aging and Human Development found that regret frequency in older adults peaks during the evening hours, precisely when external stimulation decreases and the brain's default mode network, the system that activates during self-referential thought and autobiographical review, has the least competition for your attention. This is why your worst regrets tend to arrive not during the busy part of the day, but at night, when you're lying in bed with nothing between you and your own history. Because your brain has been waiting all day for a window quiet enough to open the file, and the darkness gives it exactly that. Researchers at the University of Geneva confirmed this connection directly, finding that nocturnal regret was a significant and independent predictor of insomnia severity in older adults. Even after controlling for depression, medical conditions, and medications, which means the sleeplessness you may be experiencing is not just a product of aging or anxiety, but is your brain refusing to stop working on a problem it considers unresolved. So what are you supposed to do with this? How do you live alongside regrets that cannot be corrected, in a brain that won't stop presenting them, during a stage of life when the biological tools for dampening them are operating at reduced capacity? The answer is not what most people expect, and it is not what most self-help advice would tell you. A study out of Stephanie Brasson's lab at the University Medical Center Hamburg-Eppendorf, published in the journal Science, used functional MRI to examine how different adults process regret. And what they found was that healthy, older adults, the ones who were thriving rather than sinking into depression, did not eliminate regret from their brains. They still felt it. The orbitofrontal cortex still activated. The memory still surfaced. The difference was in what happened next. In healthy older adults, the anterior cingulate cortex, the brain's emotional regulation center, showed significantly greater activation than it did in either young adults or depressed older adults. Which means the thriving elders were not blocking the regret, but actively engaging a regulatory process that allowed them to feel it without being consumed by it. They were not pretending the past didn't happen. They were holding it and choosing, at a neural level, not to let it become the only story their brain told about who they were. Psychologist Karsten Rosch at Concordia University, who has spent years studying how regret changes across the lifespan, described this process in a way that captures exactly what the brain is trying to learn how to do. Regret, he said, is a double-edged sword. It teaches us how to change, but it can also lead to depression. And older adults need to adjust how they cope with it, because if they react to regret the way young adults do, they are significantly more likely to become depressed. The adjustment he's describing is not denial, and it is not forgiveness in the shallow, greeting card sense of that word. It is something closer to what Erickson meant by integrity, which is the willingness to look at a life that included real failures and real losses and real moments you wish you could take back, and to decide, not that those moments didn't matter, but that they are part of a larger fabric that still holds together. That the thread of regret is woven into the same cloth as the threads of love and effort, and endurance and genuine goodness, and that the cloth, taken whole, is something you can live inside without needing it to be perfect. And this is the part that I want you to hear more than anything else. Because if you are in your 70s and a regret from 40 years ago has returned with a force that frightens you, there is something your brain is trying to tell you that has nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with completion. The regret is not returning because you failed. It is returning because you grew. At 35, when the mistake happened, you did not have the emotional depth or the moral clarity or the sheer accumulation of lived experience necessary to fully understand what you had done or what you had failed to do. And so your brain filed it away, incomplete, tagged but unprocessed, stored at a resolution your younger mind couldn't access. Now, at 70, You have become someone capable of understanding that moment at a level you could not have reached when it occurred. And your brain, recognizing that you finally have the tools to process what it has been holding, has brought it back to the surface, not to break you, but to let you finish it. That is not rumination. That is not decline. That is your brain handing you back an experience and saying you are finally wise enough to do something with this. And the something it is asking you to do is not to fix it, because it cannot be fixed, but to integrate it, to let it become part of the honest story of who you are rather than a secret you keep from yourself in a locked room that drains energy every day just by existing. Research on life review therapy, a clinical approach developed specifically for older adults, has shown that people who engage in structured, honest examination of their regrets, who look at them directly and name them and place them inside the larger narrative of their lives rather than trying to suppress or ignore them, report significantly greater life satisfaction, reduced symptoms of depression, and a stronger sense of meaning and purpose than those who try to keep the door closed. The science is clear on this. The regrets that hurt the most are not the ones you face. They are the ones you refuse to face, the ones that keep knocking on the same door at 3 a.m. because you keep pretending you don't hear them. So if you are lying awake tonight and a face from 1983 appears behind your eyes and a wave of something heavy and hot moves through your chest and you find yourself whispering, "I'm sorry," to someone who isn't in the room and may not even be alive anymore, I want you to know that what is happening in that moment is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something is finally working the way it was always supposed to. Your brain has carried this for decades, protecting you from it when you weren't ready, and it is offering it to you now because it believes, on the basis of everything you have lived and learned and survived, that you are strong enough to hold it without it destroying you. And your brain is right. You are strong enough. Not because the regret doesn't hurt. It does. It hurts exactly as much as it should, because what happened mattered, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie. You are strong enough because you have arrived at the one point in your life where you can look at a mistake clearly, without the excuse of youth, and without the distraction of ambition, and without the buffer of unlimited time, and you can say, "I did that," or "I didn't do that, and it cost something real, and I have carried it, and I am still here." And being still here is not nothing. Being still here after 70 years of carrying all of it is in fact the quiet, unannounced, unrewarded proof that you were always stronger than the worst thing you ever did. That regret in your chest is not your enemy. It is the last conversation you need to have with a version of yourself who didn't know what you know now. And the most generous thing you can do for both of you is to stop running from it and to sit with it and to let it say what it came to say. And then, not to forgive yourself in the cheap and easy way that word is usually used, but to do something harder and truer, which is to accept that you are a person who made a real mistake in a real life and who became, in part because of that mistake, someone capable of understanding why it mattered, and that this understanding, which arrived decades late and cost more than you would have chosen to pay, is not worthless. It is, in fact, the specific kind of wisdom that cannot be taught or bought or borrowed or faked, the kind that only comes from having lived long enough to see the full weight of your own choices and to still, after all of it, choose to remain open rather than closed, honest rather than defended, awake rather than numb. That is not despair. That is integrity. And your brain has spent your entire life preparing you to reach it.